Hey there, Wayne Bryan here, once again for Wayne Wednesday. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope a lot of you are in the Spotlight Society because tonight we dropped movie number two in Wayne's Movie Club. It's My Sister Eileen, a 1955 musical version that was Bob Fosse's first on screen choreographic credit. So I hope you can join us. Thanks so much for writing in. Once we decided we were going to talk about flop musicals, I realized we are never going to run out of things to talk about. And I went down into the basement and pulled out some old playbills. I was looking for my playbill for Carrie the musical, which I did see, can't find it yet, and a real stinker, a legendary one called Rachel Lily Rosenblum, and don't ever forget it. We'll talk about that on a future occasion. But I wanted to say a book I forgot to mention last week that I think you would very much enjoy is by Peter Felicia. It's Broadway musicals, the biggest hit and the biggest flop of each year. And he writes about them with such understanding and such wit. And I was looking up the chapter on The Wiz because that's our movie for next week, the Wiz Live. And in the chapter where The Wiz is the biggest hit of the year, the biggest flop of that year is Good News that I was in. So wow, it's a wonderful book even with that. Uh, People asked questions about certain shows, and I wanted to just do an anecdote, and then I've stacked up things to remind myself to answer some of your questions. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Not a flop, a very successful show, but very nearly a flop because out of town, the show just wasn't landing and nobody could figure out exactly what was wrong. Well, I believe it was Jerome Robbins, was it not? Yes, it was, who came out of town to help the authors and the director figure out what was missing. And what was missing was an opening number that could tell the audience what to expect for the rest of their 2.5 hours. So Stephen Sondheim wrote a comedy tonight, and suddenly everything in the show worked just right, just by changing the opening number. A lot of these shows might have worked much better if Jerome Robbins had come out of town and said, you know what, you need to tell the audience what they're going to experience, and it sets you off on a right path. Sondheim has said, if you tell an audience the kind of show it is and show them what it is in the first 5 minutes and you're consistent with that, you have a much better chance of keeping them with you all evening. They'll go with you any kind of a show if you just let them know what they're in for. uh, James Venhouse asked about Carrie the musical based on the Stephen King book and the Carrie Spacek film. I did see it. He asked if its reputation is earned. It's covered in Ken Mandelbaum's book, Not Since Carrie. Yes, its reputation is earned. It was simultaneously a wonderful and awful musical. It had so many things go wrong with it. The British director was in discussions with the writers, and they said, well, you know, these kids, they're kind of like Greeks, meaning sororities and fraternities. Well, the British director thought he meant like Greeks, togas. So that's what the girls were dressed in when they were having their gymnasium routines. The whole thing got off on a bad start. There was one musical that was the mother and daughter story between Carrie and her very religious mother. And that was kind of exquisite and had this beautiful music, and it was very haunting. And then there was the musical about the teenagers, and it was sort of Grease meets Rocky Horror meets I don't know what. There was a drive in movie scene where they all sat and sang lyrics like, all we do is sit and park, you sit and grope me in the dark, like terrible. And then the opening number of Act Two was killing a pig to get the blood for Carrie's prank at the prom. It was so terrible. And at the end of the show finished, and you weren't quite sure Betty Buckley was dead, but it looked like she was. And half the audience started booing, and half the audience started applauding. And it was amazing. And I was on the kind of dismayed side of that crowd. Around the same time, I went to Sweeney Todd in a preview. I didn't know what to expect. I'd never seen a show like it. Again, there was blood. In fact, during the previews, the blood squirted out into the audience a few times. They hadn't regulated how to use the razors. But at the end of that, some of the audience was clearly perplexed, but much of the audience was realizing they'd seen something extraordinary. And in that case, I was happy to stand up and cheer with the rest of them. Who asked about Scottsboro Boys? Oh, Claire Manship. Claire, our beautiful Tracy in Hairspray. Scottsboro Boys was one of the best musicals I've seen in recent years. It was a beautiful show by Kander and Ebb. It dealt with a really painful episode of racial prejudice against these black fellows who were imprisoned unjustly for years. And it's a very painful story, but it was exquisitely rendered and very smart. And Susan Stroman did a great job directing and choreographing it. But right as it was about to open on Broadway, there was some flack about why are white people telling this story. And it's certainly a good question. We want authentic voices on Broadway. The African American actors who were in it all felt the story had been told wonderfully. They were proud to be part of it. Julius B. Thomas, who's from Wichita State University and one of our alumni, thought it was excellent, and I thought it was just wonderful, and I hope this will get another look. Somebody asked about Sideshow, which has had two Broadway runs, both of them short. A true story about real Siamese twins that had a tragic life. Lived in the 20s and 30s. The style of the show is pop 60s belt music. You can either go with it and think it's fun, or you can wonder why they did it that way. I'm sort of in the later camp. I can't quite get with this show. Also, there's nothing to be done to help these ladies, so you feel bad for them at the beginning of the show and you feel bad for them at the end of the show. So it's kind of hard, but oh my gosh, there are some great songs in it. The Last Ship. Who asked about that? Travis Grizel. You said you thought it didn't make it to Broadway. It did make it to Broadway in a beautiful production. If you haven't heard this album, go look it up and listen to it. The music is by Sting. It was a great score, really great score. I thought the cast was incredible. I went to see it 2 nights in a row. I loved it. It's about a bunch of shipbuilders. They're trying to close down their shipyard, and it's the only livelihood in this town. And the people in the yard decide they're going to lock themselves in and build another ship. It just had one big plot point that didn't make any sense. What were they going to do with this big ship? And it made them seem unrealistic as opposed to dedicated and noble. But there is a brand new script for this show, and if COVID-19 hadn't closed the theaters down, this new script was going to be touring the country, and I was going to go see it in Detroit. I hope this gets another look because it's an incredible show. Spider-Man, Turn Off the Dark. Turn off the musical. Kander and Ebb wrote a great show score for Flora the Red Menace. And this introduced a teenaged Liza Minnelli to Broadway, and she won her first Tony Award, this time as Best Actress in a Musical. It was incredible, but it was unsuccessful. And Kander and Ebb have always said they are probably the last generation of people who could have a flop that big. But the producer was Hal Prince, and his philosophy is on opening night, we set a date for coffee tomorrow to talk about our next project. And whatever happens with the show we opened, we've got another project to work on. And the next project they worked on was Cabaret. Not too bad. They've had a number of shows that either did or did not have commercial success. The Rink, The Happy Time, most of these shows won Tony Awards for the people involved with them. The Act, I already talked about The Rink, Steel Pier, but then most recently, posthumously, Curtains. Fred Ebb had died by the time John Kander got it to Broadway, but it was delightful, and we got to do it here, and John Kander came to see it, and it was a completely happy experience. So sometimes shows that are flops can lead to shows that are hits, and sometimes shows that are not blockbusters in New York can go on and have tremendous histories. All right, our friend Peter Felicia noticed that I had this playbill sitting here last time. This is from the Los Angeles Civic Light Opera production of Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind started as a Japanese stage spectacle. I mean, it didn't start that way, but the stage version of it did. A Japanese theater company with endless resources put on a Gone with the Wind non-musical stage play, and it went over 2 nights. So you saw part one the first night, and you came back and you saw part two the second night. And it was so spectacular that somewhere the Japanese got an idea that it would be even more successful if it were a musical. And they approached a lot of different composing teams to write a score for it. Well, as we mentioned last week, it's a lot easier to take a 90-minute movie or a short story or a novella or a play that's already established and expand it with songs as opposed to taking a movie that went 4 hours and adding songs and trying to get it to run in a 2.5 hour time slot. So it was very tricky. But first, they finally got the songwriter Harold Rome. Wish You Were Here, Fanny, a successful guy and a delightful man. I got to work with him on a revival of Wish You Were Here. And but there was always a joke about Harold Rome because his lyrics tend to be a little repetitive and it can be very effective. Wish you were here, wish you were here, wish you were here, Fanny, Fanny, Fanny. Well, his lyrics in Scarlet, the musical, this is the Japanese cast album. Here, you can read the liner notes if you can. And it was spectacular. It went long in Japan. It was a one night event, a musical. And Harold Rome wrote the songs in English and then they were translated into Japanese. And Harold Rome, his wife, wrote a really wonderful, funny book about the making of Scarlet, the musical, in Japan. And I guess the phrase for I love you in Japanese has a certain intake of breath before you say it. And so when his lyrics were I love you, I love you, I love you, and the actress was singing it in Japan, I guess it sounded just fine to the people who spoke that language. But to American ears, it was kind of funny that Scarlett sounded like she was hiccuping, taking so many intakes of breath. Well, anyway, they got it back into English and they brought it to the LA Civic Light Opera and San Francisco Civic Light Opera, and then it was going to stop off in Texas and then open on Broadway. It got as far as Texas, but it never made it to Broadway. I saw it in LA. Uh, Leslie Ann Warren was the Scarlett O'Hara. You might know her from several Disney movies. And Pernell Roberts, if those of you who watch Bonanza can remember, he was one of the four brothers on that. He had, since leaving Bonanza, not really been watching his weight too much. And Red did show up in a white suit, which didn't help things much. And because the story had to be so truncated to fit songs in, characters were introduced very quickly and kind of crudely sometimes. And there was a little green disc on stage that came on every time we were supposed to be at Terra. And so we were on this green disc and there was a crowd around and people said, there's Rhett Butler, there's Rhett Butler, there's Rhett Butler. And they parted and there was a sort of plump Pernell Roberts there. And somebody said, there's Rhett Butler. And the woman sitting in front of me loudly said, no, it's not. It was that kind of audience response on Gone with the Wind. It did not help that on opening night, the horse carrying the carriage that was to take Melanie to safety relieved itself on stage. And then it didn't help that the actors' microphones were left on when they went into the wings, and we heard their commentary on what had just happened on stage. Anyway, this was not a good idea. There is a fun composer's demo, and there is a cast album from when it played in London. One more was asked about Candide. Is one of those heartbreak flops, except it keeps being done and in new versions all the time. The original run didn't go that long, but it was revived in a scaled down version with a much wittier book later on. And now this version has formed the basis for many opera company versions and touring company versions. And we did it at Wichita State University. It's a show that has a gorgeous score by Leonard Bernstein. And thank goodness that Goddard Lieberson recorded it the first time because it lives on and on and on. I have too many more shows to talk to you about. But I think I should stop here and leave you wanting more. That's the thought anyway. Flop musicals are fascinating, and it really makes you appreciate the musicals that we do have in the repertoire where everything somehow miraculously went right. And thanks for calling. Write me more about the ones you want to know about. Interesting things like the Rocky Horror Show. That was a huge flop in New York, and then the movie came out the next year, and it wasn't successful. But then it started being shown at midnight screenings, and it was terrifically successful. You never know how these things are going to work out. So we'll see you on Friday. It's a really important Flashback Friday this Friday. So we hope to see you then. Let me know what you think.